Thank you for the invitation to come and speak today. An entirely different topic from the last one you've heard, so I hope you're ready for that transition from that to the state of British democracy. So I'm just going to outline my argument in brief so you know where this is going, and just in case I run out of time and don't quite get there. So really I want to argue, as you've heard, that the nature of democracy generally, actually, not just in Britain, has been transformed over the last 50 years, and I think it's crucial we understand that. Also that this process of transition in democracy is giving rise to some very significant dangers, but it's also giving rise to some important opportunities, and we really need to understand that. If we want to deepen, if we want to sustain democracy, we really need to understand those twin dangers and opportunities. Thirdly, I want to argue, and this might be interesting depending on who's in the audience, that universities have a critical role to play here as part of civil society, actually. I sort of rethought my abstract slightly. Rather than saying in conjunction with civil society, I think we should remind ourselves that universities are part of civil society. So I think universities have a key role here in terms of sustaining and deepening democracy, and hopefully by the end my argument will be clear and you will agree with me, I hope, but just say if you don't. So we need to start really with some idea of what democracy is. Now, famously, of course, we know, or many of us know, that democracy, the term, is derived from two ancient Greek words, demos, meaning the people, sometimes people say the mob, but the people, and kratos, which means rule. So from that we get the notion of democracy as rule of the people or government by the people. And if you ask most people, they would usually come up with some sort of definition of democracy along those lines. So this is actually just an image of, I don't know if anybody knows. Does anybody know what these are? These are pieces of pottery used for voting in ancient Greece. And some of you may have heard the term psephology. Psephos in ancient Greek meant pebble, and originally people voted with pebbles. This is where we get the term psephology for the study of elections. The pebbles were later replaced with other things such as discs, as we see here. So democracy has a very, very long history if we go back to Greece, and very many variants of democracy are possible. And one image which captures this is this picture, which is rather nice, from the Wirral in Thingwall. I don't know if there's anybody here from the Wirral, but Thingwall is the site actually of an ancient Viking assembly, which again was an early version of democracy where Viking freemen came together to make decisions. And rather nicely here we have the sign for Thingwall juxtaposed with Esther McVeigh there, who obviously was the MP for Wirral West, recently lost her seat, but hey, that's democracy, that's how it works. So we've got two different variants of democracy shown there. We should remind ourselves that representative democracy, of all of the possible types, direct democracy, participatory democracy and so on, representative democracy has certainly been the most enduring, the longest lasting, the most widely adopted, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So when we think about democracy, but particularly representative democracy, there are two core principles which it's based on, which we can take from the work of David Beetham. The first, and this will seem so familiar to you, you'll wonder if this is an academic talk at all. The first really is the idea that there should be popular control over decision making. That's the first key principle of representative democracy. So in the case of representative democracy, this means that we elect people on our behalf to make decisions for us. So by now in this country we elect councillors. If we live in Scotland, which we don't, we elect members of the Scottish Parliament. In Wales, assembly members. We elect members of the European Parliament, and of course we elect the House of Commons. So this notion of popular control over decision making is via our elected representatives. The second key principle is that of political equality, and this is the notion that everyone has an equal right to participate in democratic decision making, and that participation should count equally for all involved. So this is one of the most simple, really, democratic ideas, the notion of one person, one vote. That was contested for a long time, but now we accept it. Yeah? And it doesn't just apply to voting in democratic theory, that should apply to anybody. So when it comes to decision making in a democracy, everybody should have equal power. Now, if you think about that seriously beyond voting, that's a very radical and challenging idea, and we might want to pause and think about whether we really have that or ever could have that. So if that's what a democracy is, when did the UK become one? Well, it took quite a long time. In fact, the first English, rather than Viking Parliament, goes back to 1236, and it starts a long process of monarchs assembling people to discuss key issues, usually because the monarchs actually wanted to raise taxation and they felt they couldn't do it without at least talking to the people that they wanted to tax. So we did eventually get elections, but only a tiny minority could vote before 1832, the time of the first Reform Act, and elections were highly corrupt, certainly in the early part of the 19th century and onwards. The franchise was extended, as I said, 1832, then 1867, then 1884, then 1918. 1929, we finally get universal suffrage. So all adult men and women at the same age could vote by 1929. So we've done 700 odd years of history in a few bullet points. That's how long that part took. But we're not finished. Now, by 1929, elections were no longer seriously corrupt, but again, it took a long time to eradicate corruption from our elections. Elections were seriously beset by fraud, undue influence, and so on, and there were a series of measures in the 19th century which aimed to tackle that. One of the most important was in 1872 with the introduction of the secret ballot. Before then, people voted by putting up their hands in public or lining up and so on. And it was really only by the 1920s that we could be confident that we had fully eradicated electoral fraud, and we could argue about whether it's come back again, but we might leave that for the questions. Now, this is important, though, because this notion of political equality, certainly in voting, was not really achieved until 1948, because it was not until 1948 that we abolished people's rights to have multiple votes. And there were certain people who could vote more than once up until then, because they had university degrees, for example, or because they were property owners. So it was only the 1950 election was the first time when it was strictly one person, one vote. So it took a very long time for us to get a universal and equal franchise free from fraud. Right, it took UK a long time to get there in terms of democracy. How well does it score when we look at measures of democracy? Well, the UK is one of a very small number of countries which has been classed as a continual democracy since the 1980s on something called the Polity 4 database. I won't bore you with the details, but there aren't many countries which can claim a long pedigree in terms of democracy. And it's actually achieved a score of 10 out of 10 on this system since 1945, and there's only 20 countries in the world which can claim this. It's been designated on a slightly different schema as an electoral democracy by Freedom House, and it's about 1 out of 120 of those globally. And it's ranked 25th in the world by something called the Democracy Barometer, which measures various qualities of democracy across a large series of countries. So we're kind of in an elite group, but we're probably not at the top of it, yeah? And that's something to keep in mind. The study that I did back in 2012, this was an enormous piece of work where we looked at different dimensions of British democracy across these areas of citizenship, representative accountable government, civil society, popular participation, and so on. What we were doing there was using those principles that I introduced earlier, or introduced by David Beetham, to really try to monitor, to audit every aspect of the democratic system in Britain. It's a massive study, and I'm not going to go through it all. I'm going to give you some very quick highlights. And I'm going to suggest these in terms of long-term trends, particularly since the 1950s. And the first thing that we note is that democracy is absolutely not linear. We do not move progressively towards a more and more democratic society. We take some steps forward, we take some steps back. Often those things are occurring simultaneously, and we really, really need to be conscious of that. Democracy is a very complex and elaborate system. But there are several long-term trends in British democracy which I think are very, very concerning indeed. And these are some which I'll show you some of the evidence on, but not all of it, because there's so much of it. The first of the long-term trends that we point to is that formal democratic participation is very clearly in decline, and it's also become more and more unequal. The second is we find evidence that large corporations and wealthy individuals are exercising increased political power, which goes against that notion of political equality very, very clearly. And thirdly, we find that public faith in politics has declined, and that there may be a so-called reform paradox at work here, which is the more we attempt to democratise, the more we attempt to make the system more transparent, the more we try to respond to people's concerns, actually the more they say they've lost faith in the system altogether. And again, we might come back to that in questions and so on. So some of the data, this is one of the simplest measures. This is turnout at UK general elections since 1945. You could be optimistic and say, well, it's going up since 2001. That would technically be true. But if you look at elections since 1997, they are all lower. All of the turnout since 1997 are lower than all of the elections prior to that. So we've moved into a period of low turnout, and we are nowhere near where we used to be in the 50s and 60s with turnouts in the high 70s, even early 80s. I should add, the problem is even worse than this, because the state of the electoral register is now such that there may be up to 6 or 7 million people missing from the register. Let's not miss it. There's a blip there with the red line. That's Tony Blair. That's Tony Blair. But essentially the story is one of decline. Now, if I'd taken it through to 2015, then we would get to the point that we see Labour membership going up under Jeremy Corbyn. But to be honest, on that graph, it's a blip. It's a blip compared to those long-term trends. Very long-term, very serious decline in party membership. This graph shows turnout by social class, 1997 to 2015. The point of this is that class AB, which is the nice blue lines on the left of each election year, turnout among those higher social classes, A and B, is significantly higher than it is in the other classes, and the gap between social class AB and DE has become wider and wider over time. So if you look at 2015, 75% of those in the higher social classes voted, only 57% of those in social classes D and E. The number or the proportion of MPs from working class backgrounds has fallen very, very steeply over time. These figures only go back to 1979. The Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats never had many MPs from working class backgrounds, as you'll see there. But in the Labour Party, we've seen an enormous fall from around about a third of their MPs down to just 9% in 2010. I don't have the data yet for 2015, but I suspect it's fallen further still. So in terms of who is in Parliament, in terms of who our representatives are, there are big changes by social class. At the same time, we've seen from the information we've got on who gives money to political parties, we've seen a significant increase in the amount of money coming from very wealthy individuals. Well, how do I know these individuals are wealthy? Well, I'm assuming it on the basis that they're giving £50,000 or more. So I don't know if you could give £50,000 to a political party. I couldn't. So these are the figures for those who do, and we see the big increase from 2001 through to 2010. And predictably, it's the Conservatives who particularly benefit from individuals giving that amount of money. So inevitably what's happened, as membership has declined, you've got less and less money coming in from membership fees and more from these really big donations. And the question is, does that mean the wealthy influence politics as a result? I'm going to skip over that one and just show you this one. This is data on the connections between big corporations and parliamentarians. The figure on the left is for the UK, and then the others are averages for different groups of democracy. The point is the massive contrast between the figures for the UK and everywhere else. So the UK, this is the mid-2000s, had 46% of its top 50 firms which were connected to a parliamentarian or a minister in some way through shareholdings or directorships. Yeah? And if you look at those other countries, the levels were significantly different. It's higher than almost every country in the world for which we have data. Very, very strong connections between the economic and the political elite. Right, I don't know how much time I've got left. How much? Probably not much. So how do we make sense of this? Thanks. How do we make sense of this? Well, I think two useful accounts we can look at in terms of how democracy may be in transition based on this kind of data, these kinds of trends. One is the account of post-democracy presented by Colin Crouch, and the other is that of monitory democracy associated with John Keane, 2009. And in different ways, these two accounts, they tell similar stories. So Crouch, for example, talks about the fact that we still have elections, but increasingly decisions are being made between interlocking corporate and political elites. John Keane, again, says we've still got elections, but talks about democratic values and principles being much more based on what he calls watchdogs, guide dogs, and barking dogs. Now, these are euphemisms for a variety of things. Watchdogs are things like a Human Rights Commission, Electoral Commission, these kind of monitory bodies that we have, which check that everything is in order. Guide dogs are advocacy bodies for people, with particular needs and so on. Barking dogs are your campaign groups, and very often the media as well. Yeah. So Keane is saying actually politics is much more happening in those places rather than in the political parties, elections, parliaments. Crouch points out that inequality is widening, but politics itself is becoming more open. It's becoming more scrutinised. Politics is becoming less deferential. Keane says, in a similar way, there are more elaborate checks and balances now, which now tame power, which hold the powerful to account because of these watchdogs, these guide dogs, these barking dogs. They both come to the same conclusion, that we seem to have gone beyond the idea of rule by the people, where I started, to something else, to challenge the idea of rule at all, the rule that nobody should rule. This is what they're saying is happening to democracy. Well, if this is true, I think there are dangers and I think there are opportunities. The dangers are that we are now in an era which fosters anti-politics and in which politicians cede control because actually they think that's how they respond to being unpopular. Yeah? They say, we won't do that anymore because you don't like us. We'll give that to an independent body. There is an opportunity here, though, that democratic values are becoming more embedded in all aspects of political, economic and social life. Another danger of these systems of democracy we now have is that it's become uneven. There are some institutions and individuals who are far more scrutinised than others. Jeremy Corbyn's certainly being scrutinised. Stop the War is being scrutinised. Perhaps some other organisations aren't. On the other side, there is far greater scope, we may argue, to hold the powerful to account for their actions as democracy evolves in this way. Another danger, political inequalities are continuing to widen, certainly with respect to social class, and that may continue unchecked. But we do have growing recognition of wider equality and diversity agendas, particularly around gender, ethnicity, and so on. Skip that. Right, 2 minutes then, I think, on why universities. Why do universities matter to this? Well, I think they matter because universities are part of civil society. As I've said, they're not part of the state and they are not part of the free market. You may think that they behave in both of those ways at times, but they are very much part of civil society. But the role of universities is changing quite fundamentally. Universities are moving towards concerns about their wider impact, as we've just been hearing, knowledge exchange, KE, open access to information and data and research, rising participation, and so on. Now, in these new systems of democracy I've been talking about, knowledge really is power. It's a bit of a cliche, but it really, really is. And who wields that knowledge and how, I think, is very important. And I think universities can provide a counterweight to some of the actors which we now see involved in these processes. Universities for now, I'm not saying that's safe, I'm not saying it's going to remain, but universities are among the most trusted institutions. University academics are among the most trusted professions. I think we can make good use of that when it comes to the democratic sphere. So this is my last slide. I've got some ideas then, based on all of that, how universities can help sustain this new democratic era. One is, first of all, I think universities can do a lot more as what I call levelling social capital. We have an unequal society. People have different backgrounds, different skills, different knowledge, different networks. There's one critical place where that can be levelled out, and I think that's universities. It might be the last chance in most people's lives for that to happen. I can elaborate on this afterwards if you like. I think there's a lot of potential there. I think universities go halfway in achieving it. We could do more. I think we could also do more to educate for democratic citizenship. In Iceland, a key educational goal is to educate people so that they can participate in a democratic society. This isn't just for politics students, I think, in universities. This could be for everybody. The issue of statistical literacy, for example, is absolutely critical in how we engage in democratic debates now, given the information which is flung at us routinely and often very seriously misused. I think we can look at ways that we could recognise and foster active citizenship in our curriculum. Perhaps we should reward students somehow towards their degrees when they become involved in politics, in volunteering and so on, in ways that we don't currently. Critically, I think universities can also help, working with civil society and other organisations, build the tools for enhanced democratic accountability. Now, this is complex. There is so much information out there. Because of the transparency agenda, we've got huge amounts of data about everything. Donations to political parties, which boards MPs are on, which shareholdings peers have. Now, there is a huge job of analysis to be done there to make sense of that, to connect it up. Universities can do a lot there, I think, and it involves building new tools, working with computer scientists, I think, critically, to enable that information to be used for the purposes of accountability. I also feel universities need to lead by example. They need to democratise access to knowledge. They need to challenge misuse of evidence, which is now part of the course in political debates. And finally, I'd like to suggest that universities could operate as democracy hubs. At the University of Liverpool, we have something called the Law Clinic, for example. Access to legal services is a real problem for people now, particularly with the diminishing of legal aid. So students at the university offer legal advice to people in Liverpool and beyond through a free at the point of access law clinic. Well, we could extend that more generally. We could extend that into any kind of issues where people want to take something to a public body, or they just want a space in order to debate an issue. I think there's great scope where we could really get universities to open up and, as I say, become hubs for democracy. So I hope that's food for thought. I look forward to the questions.